Hello and welcome to another episode of Small Town Gospel. You're probably noticing that this is not Alana giving the introduction. She was not able to be here today, so you're with me, Alex, and today a good friend of mine and a missionary that our church supports, Luke Lacey, is with us. Thanks for coming.
Well, thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, and we thought we could just sit down with you and get a little bit of your story, what you do, what your work is, a little glimpse of your testimony, and then maybe a few windows into some broader discussions. So before we get into your testimony, can you just give a brief rundown of what you're up to, what your ministry is?
Yeah, so my wife and I, we came to the Flathead Indian Reservation as church planting missionaries. And so our church, Valley Bible Fellowship, started to meet weekly January 2020. And so
Interesting time to start a church.
Yeah. But we're thankful to the Lord for His faithfulness through that, and so we're involved in the life of the church, and I pastor or am an elder there with the church, and still just in the beginning stages and working to develop other elders and deacons. But I do the majority of the preaching and teaching. But then as a couple, we're also involved in the community as a way to be a light and to share the gospel. And I drive bus for the local school. And then recently, my wife and I just received two Native children into our home, Native Americans. We're hoping and praying that it'll work for us to adopt them.
Okay.
Gemini is 4, and she is enrolled Blackfeet, and then Azariah was a newborn, and he'll be enrolled Salish. So we're busy with them and with the church and outreach and as well as other things.
Okay.
Yeah,
and I would say maybe just a little under a year ago, our church was finally able to start partnering with you guys, and it's pretty cool to have missionaries who in one sense are local and in another sense are in a different nation. Mm-hmm. And what are you, probably 2.5 hours away from Troy? Something like that. So, and then regular listeners will recognize Luke's name. I've mentioned him a few times. You are a godsend in a literal sense in my life, especially these days when we don't have any other elders in our church, and maybe we'll tease that out a little bit later here. So one of the fascinating parts of your life is the move that you made a few years ago. So can you explain the missionary work that you were doing before coming to Raleigh?
Yeah, so my wife and I, we were serving as missionaries in South Africa. We had been there for 4 years. We were working with a ministry that came alongside different local churches and provided training and equipping, as well as there was a discipleship program where students would come for a year and study God's Word. But as we were there, we just really sensed the Lord laying upon our heart and really calling us to more of a church planting ministry, as well as to serving in a place where the opportunity to hear the gospel isn't as readily available. So in South Africa, there's a lot of Christians, and the gospel has been there for many years, and millions of Christians throughout the country, and they're sending missionaries really all over the world. It was interesting to come back on furlough and run into South African missionary church planters to Seattle, and it's like that's my neck of the woods, and
Right.
and so we just sensed the Lord was leading us to go to a place, as Paul said, he made it his ambition to preach Christ where he hadn't been made known, and it just became apparent that here in Montana, where I'm from, especially on the reservations for the natives, the gospel hasn't really taken root yet, and there are very, very few believers. And so it was just interesting as we looked into different options of where the Lord could be directing us. It became apparent that He was opening up the doors and leading us to the Flathead reservation. And it's in the Lord's providence, it's just amazing the amount of similarities between South Africa and the dynamics that we face on this reservation. So
Yeah, that was one of the most interesting things to me that you mentioned. There you were on the outskirts of Johannesburg, population well over 1 million.
Oh,
right?
9 million.
Not 9 million.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you have, there's all the images that come to mind when you think about a missionary to Africa, but you're in this very wealthy metropolitan city. And then you come to America, and you're in a very, very small town. What's the population of
Probably about 70.
Okay.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So someone can do the math of the percentage there. What's the percentage? 70 divided by 9 million. So many things that are drastically different and perhaps the opposite of what you would expect. The African experience was where the gospel was more prominent, a bigger city, more money, and then the American situation is a much smaller town and more poverty and that kind of thing. But the similarities, what are some of the similarities that you've encountered?
So some of the similarities, and particularly in our reservation, in South Africa there are multiple tribes. About 11 official languages, each representing a different ethnic group or tribe. So there's the Xhosa, the Zulu, the Sotho, the Tswana. But then it's also interesting because in South Africa it was colonized by Western nations. The French Huguenots first went there, but then after that the Dutch came and colonized. And then gold was found, and the English were like, oh, I want a piece of that. So they came and they colonized. And so now in South Africa, you've got these tribal people who are coming from really a tribal culture and tribal worldview, multiple tribes, but then the interaction of these Western cultures having came and colonized, and so you've got a very English and very Western and Dutch, Afrikaans kind of thing. So in South Africa, it's an interesting mix of really Western culture and then, for lack of a better term, majority world culture, which would be kind of tribal. That mixes or doesn't really mix. Clashes in everyday living. So it was so interesting coming here to Montana and being on the reservation where we serve, because there's multiple tribes, indigenous tribes from North America. So our particular reservation is set aside for the Salish, the Upper Kalispel or the Pend Oreille, and the Kootenai. There's those three tribes, but because of a local tribal college, and just because of how nice the land is on the reservation, it attracts a lot of people from other tribes. So there's a lot of Blackfeet, there's Coeur d'Alene, there's Ojibwe, there's Apache, there's Navajo, there's Sioux, there's Hopi. There's so many different tribes that are all there, while at the same time, our reservation has actually more non-natives or white people than tribal people on it. As a whole, even though it's a reservation.
Sure.
And included with that is a whole Amish community, and which is the only Amish community on a reservation in the U.S. or I think anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
And so very interesting but similar dynamics, because the tribal people here in North America have very similar cultural understandings and worldview to the tribal people in Africa.
Okay. Yeah.
So when we were there in South Africa, we showed one of our friends. He is also from the same tribe as Nelson Mandela. We showed him a video that was taken of the Blackfeet tribe up in Browning, and we just asked him, like, do you see any similarities to your beliefs and stuff, or your people's beliefs? And he looked at us and he said, it's the exact same thing we believe, just different faces.
Wow. Okay.
And he was explaining to us some of the nuances that we didn't really pick up when we were watching it and stuff. So it's just interesting what we had experienced in South Africa on a big scale. Really prepared us for what we lived through on the reservation, kind of in a more condensed version.
Sure. Tim Keller has a lot to say about culture, and when you're bringing the gospel to a culture, there are aspects of a culture to affirm and that align with biblical principles, and there are aspects of every culture that you need to confront, idols to tear down. In your context, and with some similarities from Africa to Rivali, what are the pieces of culture, for lack of a better word, white culture, that stand out that you would biblically affirm versus confront? And then what are the aspects of the more tribal cultures that you might affirm and confront?
Well, it's a loaded question that could get me in trouble.
That's the point.
When it's on record.
Yeah.
So to a certain extent, within Western culture, there's a certain sense in which a lot of it would affirm biblical understandings of personal responsibility and personal ownership, valuing a hard work ethic. I think historically Western culture would affirm what the Bible would talk about, the family being a man and a woman with children and raising those children. And so I think there's some different aspects of Western culture. I guess I struggle to call it white culture.
Sure. Yep. Fair enough.
But I think there's some of those things that are traditionally a part of that culture that were rooted out of and came from biblical principles and understandings. But I think to a certain extent, accepting and embracing personal responsibility in a real sense has led to the worship of the individual, personal autonomy.
In Western cultures.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
In a very real sense, where it becomes all about the individual and the individual's feelings and saying I can do what I want because I'm my own being.
Yeah.
And that's what we see happen.
Ironically, that's Nelson Mandela. I am the Invictus poem where he talks about being the master of his own destiny and that kind of a thing. And he's perhaps at the intersection of the two worlds, but anyway, yeah.
Which is so. So there's certain aspects there. There's also, along with the value of hard work and stuff, I think a lot of times within Western culture, greed and envy has become a huge motivating factor.
Sure.
Because these principles that come from Scripture, divorced from a worship of the one true God, lead to sinful behavior.
Yeah.
So, within we'll just call it majority world culture. I guess that's what some missiologists would call it. They're more of a communal culture where the identity of the individual isn't necessarily found within their personal identity, but within the identity of the group that they are a part of. And so because of that, the way that they define what right and wrong isn't primarily based upon an inward feeling of being guilty or innocent. It's more an external reality of what brings shame to their group or honor to their group.
Sure. That
they're a part of, and then that's where how they come up with their morals. Some of the I guess really good aspects of the culture is tribal culture, majority world culture knows how to look out for one another. When it's not tainted by selfish desires.
Yeah.
But in its pure form, there's the certain sense of which, well, we're part of the same family. So, like when you look in Acts, the early church, where they're selling their goods and giving to the other people who are part of the church, for us as Westerners, we look at that and we say, man, that was extreme. But to a certain extent, within a tribal culture, there's this understanding that if someone in your tribe has a need and you have what it takes to meet that need, it's shameful not to meet that need.
Yeah. And that's clearly the assumption of the New Testament.
Yeah.
The whole Bible.
Yeah. And if you have the means to meet that need and you don't, you bring shame upon yourself and upon the group or the family that you're a part of.
Yeah.
And so in a certain sense, tribal cultures or majority world cultures understand what it looks like to show hospitality. They understand what it looks like to generously give to meet the needs of the others who are in need. I think part of the problem is, though, is within that culture for them to have a deeper allegiance to the Lord and to the family of God than their own family.
Yeah.
Because within their own family, they've come to realize that, well, yeah, my blood family is going to be reaching out for my needs, so I don't really have a need for the family of God. And so that's a hard thing. That's a hard part of evangelism, because the way that they see the world and their worldview isn't first and foremost about them as an individual, but they think about, well, I'm a part of this family, I'm a part of this group, and for me to leave it, I'm leaving all of the benefits that come, and it's very shameful, and it brings a lot of shame upon this family group, and it can become hard to really commit to Christ and to the gospel, and to being a part of the life of the church, the family of God. But when there is that commitment to the church and to the family of God, it just becomes natural. A lot of these things that we see being lived out in the New Testament, because that's how they see the world. Yeah. And I think along with what we're this discussion within the majority world culture, a lot of times it's to come to the point of understanding that you're saved as an individual. That the Lord saves an individual into a community. He doesn't save people as, this community is saved. He saves a particular individual, but they're born again into a family.
Yeah.
So the individual aspect of the gospel, and the individual aspect of Scripture, and the individual aspect of personal responsibility and personal sanctification and growth, a lot of times it's hard.
Sure. And that we're at our church just starting in the book of Romans, and it's interesting how there has to be this ongoing discussion on that very point, because the Jewish assumption was, I'm a part of this group of people, so I'm saved. And he's saying what makes you a Jew is the faith of Abraham. And of course there's a little controversy embedded in that statement. But clearly not every ethnic Jew is saved. And that, I imagine, is a struggle there. So is there in your context specifically, is there kind of the association among the tribal people that biblical Christianity is like the white man's religion, and it sort of is like selling out to become a Christian?
Well, in our particular context, it's a complicated topic, because biblical Christianity, what they know as Christianity, is Catholic.
Okay.
So, and this is just part of the history. The Catholic Church really was used as a pawn of the U.S. government, with the express goal of killing the native culture. So the U.S. government's slogan that was adopted was "Kill the Indian, save the person." And the tool in which they were using to fulfill that was Catholic boarding schools. So Native kids were taken from their families and put into Catholic boarding schools, where if they spoke their language, they would be beaten, and other just horrible atrocities happened. You know, a lot of molestation and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
So, and that's recent history. You know, I think the last boarding school, because it happened here in the U.S. and in Canada, I think the last boarding school closed down, may have been, I forget, but the last one was in Canada, and I think it was like in the 1970s or something like that.
Sure.
So not long ago. And there was a boarding school 5 miles from our house where this was happening. And on our reservation, a lot of the natives, the older natives, were in these boarding schools.
Sure.
And were directly affected by the sinful acts of the priests and the nuns, which has been passed on to the successive generations.
Yeah.
So in the natives' mind, when they think of Christian, they identify it with Catholicism. So when it comes to actual biblical Christianity, they don't. By and large, there isn't really an understanding of what that is and what that looks like.
Which is, I assume, part of your mission, right?
Yeah, but it's very difficult, and I think some people say that reaching natives with the gospel, it's one of the hardest mission fields because of the history.
Right. It's not going to where there's no familiarity. It's going to where there's deep-seated negative familiarity, and sort of having to heal some of those wounds before you can even start. Not, God can transcend all that, of course, but so the demographics of your area there is close to 50-50 as far as folks of European descent and folks of tribal descent. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would say in our part of the reservation, we're on the southern part of the reservation. I think that's probably close.
Okay.
If you take the reservation as a whole, there's more non-natives than natives, but in our particular area, and so I look at the local school where I drive bus, I would say it's pretty close to a 50-50.
Okay.
For the kids who attend.
And does the reservation extend all the way up? And encapsulate Flathead Lake?
2/3 of Flathead Lake. Okay. So it isn't, the reservation doesn't go the whole way around Flathead Lake, but the majority of Flathead Lake. Yeah.
So the demographics then of your congregation, is it an explicit goal for you that the demographics of your church would kind of mirror the demographics of the community where they're, close to 50-50? Or do you kind of, whoever ends up being there, even if it's 90% white, that's okay? Or what's your mindset as far as that goes?
Yeah, I think our prayer is that the Lord would do a mighty work and that there would be conversions of people from all the different ethnicities, and that there would be a real sense of diversity, like we see like at the start of the church in Philippi. You know, you look at how the Lord worked and you have Lydia, who's this, this wealthy business lady. Then you've got this young, used to be slave girl who had been demon possessed, of a different ethnicity, and all of these things all coming together to start this church. And we know that the Lord is more than able to do that. But we're also aware that in the New Testament, it's saying it's the church of this area.
Mm-hmm.
It's the church of Philippi, or the church of Ephesus, or the church of Colossae. And so for our desire is we want to be a church for the area and the believers who are in the area.
Yeah.
And part of the reality is there's just very few Christians around.
Yeah.
And so to get to the point of saying, well, I want an all-native church or an all-white church, or trying to target a particular demographic, isn't really, I don't believe is fulfilling what we see as the New Testament heart of it being a local assembly of the believers.
Yep.
And there's a certain sense in which there are times where there can be friction or tension between different cultures, but being a part of the family of God transcends all of that.
Yeah.
And our prayer is to have a local assembly that can be that light to the surrounding community and world that is so divided.
Sure. Yeah. What are you preaching through right now?
Genesis.
Okay.
Yeah. Just with the craziness that's happening in our world, it's so important to go back to the foundations. And so, yeah.
Yeah. What chapter are you getting ready for right as we speak?
Chapter 3. So
Okay.
just getting into the fall.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you are one of the things I really appreciate about you, and pretty early on in our friendship, we talked a lot about ecclesiology and the structure of a local church, and the importance of men taking leadership positions seriously, and biblically qualified men, and a plurality. How do you go about leadership development there at your church?
So a big piece of it is time.
Right. Yep.
And my heart's desire is that my philosophy of ministry would be similar to Paul's in the book of 1 Thessalonians, where he talks about how when he was with the believers there in Thessalonica, he was happy to share with them not only the gospel of God, but their own lives as well, because they had become so dear to them. And then he uses the different metaphors, the metaphor of the nursing mother, who is just sacrificially giving of herself, and then the father who provides correction and instruction, and then throughout the whole book he calls them brothers over and over again. So I guess my philosophy and for the goal of wanting to see leadership developed is a family kind of philosophy of by God's grace wanting to live life with the different individuals as the family of God, and in the midst of that, as things come up, seek to to equip and stir them on towards love and good deeds. And I'm thankful to the Lord. There's, within our congregation, our small congregation, there are some more elderly people who have walked with the Lord for many years, and so I'm so thankful to the Lord for them, and want to give them opportunities to be involved in ministry and stuff. But then there's also other families who are middle-aged and on down, and so in each person's life, the interaction will look different. But my heart and desire is Paul's philosophy of sharing the gospel of God and opening up the Word, but also sharing our lives as well.
Sure.
And part of it is we do want to see native leadership trained and equipped.
Mm-hmm.
Because Paul told Titus to go to each of the towns and to appoint elders. And really on our reservation, amongst the Salish people, there may be one who would be considered a pastor.
Okay. Yeah.
On the whole reservation.
Yeah.
And so it's a big need.
Right.
But it's also one of those things that we just realize it just takes time.
Yeah.
And prayer and a lot of living life together and giving and praying and trusting the Lord to work.
Sure. Do you feel like are you encouraged with how things are? Like right now you are still a solo elder, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm a solo elder. There's another gentleman in the church that I look to in a lot of ways almost as an elder. And I think at some point maybe it'll become official, but it's just in the start of a new church not wanting to lay on hands hastily.
Sure.
As Paul told Timothy. And so I'm thankful for that. When it comes to the desire to equip native leadership to become an elder, it's just going to be a long road.
Sure. And comes with the territory, I suppose, of the mission that God has given you. You've been doing this specifically as a church planting pastor. If you're making a Venn diagram and one circle is pastor and the other circle is missionary, what would you say just to pastors? Paul told Timothy to be doing the work of an evangelist, and that's an area that I fall short pretty big time, to be quite honest with you. What would you say to encourage pastors to have more of a missionary mindset?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, it's twofold. One, with Paul telling Timothy to do the work of an evangelist, and you think in Ephesians where it talks about how the Lord gave, apostles, and then it says he gave evangelists and shepherds and teachers for equipping the saints for the work of the ministry. So one of the roles of the evangelist is to equip other believers to share the gospel. So that is one of the aspects of pastoring that is so important for pastors, is evaluating and saying, in my preaching, in my teaching, in my counseling, what are particular ways in which I can help equip the people in my congregation to share the gospel as they go about their life? Which is so needed. Because, when I think about my congregation, it's not a huge congregation, but when I think about the different individuals who attend, between each of those individuals, they have connections and contact with the majority of the people, not only in River Valley, but also in Arlene and in the area around. So the amount of influence that they can have is far greater than the influence that I can just have personally. So there's that sense. But then there is also the sense of, as a pastor, one of the qualifications is that the elder needs to have a good, needs to be thought well of in the community. Yeah. So in order to be thought well of in the community and in the area, there has to be interaction in the community.
Right. Yep.
And so for me, what it's looked like is driving bus, and there've come opportunities to share the gospel through that. Now I'm playing the Christian radio station that has sermons on it. I just have that going in my bus while driving down the road and stuff. It's like, and have opportunities to share and stuff. In each different context, it's going to look a little different.
Sure.
For some pastors, it may look like going and working out at the local gym, and through that developing relationships and being able to share the gospel in that way, or just going to the same coffee shop. When you think about a small town, a lot of small towns has a coffee shop, and the same people work there all the time, and so going there and just being intentional and having conversations. Right. A lot of times in small towns, you go to these small businesses, the people who are working there, a lot of times business is slow, and so they enjoy having conversations. Right. And so it's a good way to engage in those conversations, and then pray that the Lord just gives wisdom on being able to ask good questions that can lead to gospel conversations.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it sounds like music practice is starting here in the building that we're borrowing, but thank you so much for joining us, and wish you well.
Thanks so much, brother.